It was on a fog-laden evening in late November that I first encountered the peculiar case which would come to occupy the better part of my winter months and test even the remarkable faculties of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. London was in one of its habitual moods of somber introspection, a pall of mist lying over the Thames like a shroud, and the gas lamps along Baker Street flickered weakly as though fighting against the oppressive gloom. I had returned from my rounds at St. Bartholomew's with a light step and a mind fatigued only by routine, yet eager for the comforts of home, when a most unusual interruption presented itself. Holmes, as I found upon entering our shared quarters at 221B, was in one of his rare states of idleness. He sat in his accustomed armchair, the corners of his long hawk-like face cast in shadow by the flickering fire, his violin resting idly upon his knee. A half-empty pipe sat between his fingers, the smoke curling in lazy spirals towards the ceiling, which seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of something more than domestic monotony. His eyes, however, were keen and restless, and he did not fail to greet me with a glance that was both calculating and teasing. "Ah, Watson," he said, voice low and precise, "you return at just the moment when London promises to reveal one of its more curious aberrations. Pray, sit. I believe we shall have some excitement before the night is over." I removed my coat and gloves, noting the unusual tension in his manner. Holmes rarely indulged in prophecy without some pressing reason, and I was naturally inclined to inquire. But before I could speak, a sharp, insistent knock rattled the front door, a sound which immediately set Holmes' attention alight with anticipation. It was not merely the arrival of a visitor, there was an air of desperation about it, a sense of urgency that could only signify trouble. Mrs. Hudson answered with her usual mixture of curiosity and apprehension, and I heard the whispered exchange of voices before the figure was ushered into our sitting room. As the door opened, a woman stepped across the threshold, her figure small and tremulous beneath a heavy cloak, her gloved hands wringing a folded handkerchief with anxious persistence. There was something immediately arresting about her manner and elegance, despite evident distress, which spoke of a family accustomed to some measure of comfort, yet now brought low by fear or misfortune. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice quavering but firm, "I fear for my family. I have nowhere else to turn. They say you are the only man who can unravel what even the police have failed to understand." Holmes rose, his long form casting a shadow against the firelight, and inclined his head slightly. "Madam," he said in his quiet, deliberate fashion, "you may rest assured that I will consider your words with all the attention they merit. Pray, sit, and tell me the nature of this disturbance." She seated herself, clasping her hands tightly. Her eyes, wide and unnerving in their sincerity, met mine in silent plea. "It is our home, 17 Upper Wimpole Street," she began. "For the past 3 weeks, my husband and I, and indeed the household, have been plagued by an occurrence that defies explanation. It began with sound footsteps, moving slowly up and down the staircase, yet no one was there. Lamps extinguished without reason. Doors open in the dead of night. The servants are terrified and refuse to ascend the staircase after dusk. I confess, I too have felt an unease that I cannot dismiss as mere imagination." Holmes' expression was one of polite skepticism mingled with genuine intrigue. He seated himself opposite her, hands steepled. "Footsteps, you say, on the staircase alone?" "At what hours?" "Between midnight and 3 in the morning," she replied. "Always in the hours when the house is at rest. At first we thought it might be a prank, perhaps by the new footman, but—" She hesitated, her gaze falling. "We have dismissed all rational possibilities. And now, this evening, a most troubling incident has occurred. My husband was descending the staircase when he swears he saw a figure, a man, or perhaps a shadow, gliding down the steps toward him, vanishing as suddenly as it appeared. He is beside himself with fear, and we know not what to do." Holmes leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing, the analytical cogs of his mind evidently beginning to turn. "And the police?" he asked, in that tone which implies both curiosity and a subtle reproach. "Have they not been consulted?" "They have," she replied, her voice trembling, "but they laugh at our concerns. They attribute the noises to drafts, or old wood settling. They suggest superstition. But, Mr. Holmes, we are not given to flights of fancy. Something unnatural is at work. We beg of you find the truth." Holmes was silent for a few moments, a faint smile playing upon his lips. I, familiar with the subtle warning in such smiles, knew that he was already several steps ahead, dissecting the story for its hidden inconsistencies and latent clues. I, meanwhile, remained at my customary distance, observing, chronicling, noting the small tremors in her hands, the restless movements of her eyes, and the delicate set of her shoulders, a constellation of human emotion that rarely misled one who knew how to read it. "Very well, madam," Holmes said at last. "We shall see this house for ourselves. We will ascertain whether the disturbances are the work of human hands, of some mischief-making individual, or, as you fear, something beyond ordinary comprehension." The woman's relief was almost audible. "Oh, thank you, Mr. Holmes. I knew you would understand. I cannot tell you how long we have waited for someone to believe us." Holmes nodded once and rose, turning to me. "Watson, we are to leave at once. I desire a preliminary view of the staircase, and I would have you take note of every detail: the creaking of the steps, the positioning of doors, the proximity of windows, the interplay of light and shadow. These will prove invaluable." I obediently gathered my coat, and together we departed into the foggy night. The streets were slick with rain, reflecting the dim glows of gas lamps and the occasional startled carriage passing in haste. Holmes' stride was long and purposeful. His eyes, ever searching, noted the minutiae of the world: the way a hansom cab's wheels displaced puddles, the subtle signs of recent activity in shop windows, the faint aroma of coal smoke mingling with the dampness of the November air. I found myself, as always, both in awe and in anticipation, wondering what peculiar mechanism of reason would unlock the mysteries of the haunted staircase. Upon reaching Upper Wimpole Street, we were met by a modest but respectable townhouse. Its facade, though neat and orderly, bore the patina of age: slightly warped window frames, a front door swollen from dampness, and the faintest hint of neglect in the trim. Holmes inspected the entrance with a careful eye, noting, I suspected, the minute abrasions upon the threshold and the faint smudge of dust that might indicate a recent passage. Once inside, we were escorted by the lady to the staircase itself, a narrow, wooden structure, ascending in a single flight from the entrance hall to the upper rooms. Holmes ran his finger lightly along the banister, examined the steps, and tapped upon the paneling. I watched him with that mixture of fascination and professional respect which has accompanied me through every case. "Curious," he murmured. "There is an irregularity here, Watson. Notice the wear upon these steps. It is not consistent with ordinary use. Some steps show the marks of heavier tread, while others, despite age, remain nearly pristine. Also observe these minute scratches along the riser, indicative of a small object dragged rather than a human step." The lady and her husband looked on, puzzled. Holmes' mind was clearly already dissecting the situation. I, faithful chronicler, could only record, in meticulous detail, each observation, every inflection in his voice, and the way the shadows seemed to flicker more oddly, as if in response to his scrutiny. It was clear that what we faced was not merely a domestic disturbance or a mischievous prank. London, with all its fog and darkness, was about to present to us a puzzle of the most singular variety, and I, ever loyal to Holmes, felt the familiar thrill of both dread and intellectual exhilaration. In that dimly lit hall, at the foot of the haunted staircase, I knew that a mystery both intricate and unnerving had taken root, and that our wits alone must untangle it. Thus began the case which would, in the weeks to come, test Holmes' genius and my own powers of observation, and bring us face to face with shadows that were at once tangible and elusive, of human fear and calculated design. The fog outside seemed thicker now, as if London itself conspired to conceal the truth. And yet, I had faith in Holmes, in his astonishing faculties, and in the inexorable logic that, sooner or later, must illuminate even the darkest staircase. The morning following our first encounter with the Wimpole Street household found us once more in the familiar warmth of Baker Street. And I, though eager to resume my medical duties, could not tear my thoughts from the enigmatic staircase which had, in so brief a span, cast a shadow over the lives of its occupants. Holmes, as always, had retired to his armchair with his violin, though he appeared to be engaged in an entirely different pursuit. From my vantage near the fire, I observed him tapping the bow idly against the strings, yet the melody was absent. It seemed merely an extension of his thought, a means by which he externalized the workings of his formidable mind. "Watson," he began abruptly, without preamble, "I find that a curious case often benefits from an initial diversion. While our Wimpole Street friend's fears are indeed most genuine, it is a matter of prudence to flex our faculties upon a preliminary puzzle, lest the mind rust with inactivity. I inclined my head. Holmes possessed an unerring sense of the most subtle clue, yet I was accustomed to his caprices. He delighted in demonstrating the prowess of his deductions upon matters seemingly trivial to the uninitiated. "Observe this," he continued, reaching toward a scrap of paper upon which he had drawn a rough sketch of a letter he had received the previous day. "It is from a client who resides in Pimlico. He writes that a valuable miniature painting has gone missing, though there is no forced entry. I propose that we examine this, not for the sake of the painting, but for what it may reveal about human cunning and oversight." I glanced at the document. It was the kind of commonplace note which might ordinarily escape notice, but Holmes' eyes gleamed with that peculiar light which I have come to recognize as the harbinger of revelation. "Notice," he said, pointing to a small, nearly invisible smear of ink upon the corner, the direction in which the ink spread upon the paper. One might assume it accidental, yet it suggests the letter was held at a peculiar angle, possibly while being read in dim light. Further, the irregular spacing of the words betrays the hand of a man either hurried or nervous. From this we can surmise the character of the writer's immediate circumstances and emotional state. I could not help but marvel, as I so often did, at the precision with which Holmes dissected such trivialities. "It seems almost incredible," I remarked, "that one might derive character from such minute details. Done nothing is trivial, Watson," he replied, the corners of his mouth curling in a faint sardonic smile. "The universe presents itself in its minutiae, and only he who observes with unerring attention can extract the essence of truth." I set aside my astonishment, knowing better than to challenge his reasoning while in the throes of one of his analytical flights. Holmes spent the better part of an hour reconstructing the miniature theft entirely from the scraps of evidence afforded by the letter and by reports from the household staff. He determined, with an almost surgical precision, the likely hours of entry, the probable route by which the painting was removed, and even the psychological profile of the thief. It was, I confess, a demonstration that left me at once awed and humbled. Yet, despite the brilliance of this diversion, Holmes' thoughts continually returned to the haunted staircase. He paced the room, hands behind his back, occasionally stopping to glance at the fire or to tap his fingers upon his chin. Finally he spoke. "The staircase, Watson, is a riddle of human psychology more than mere construction. Consider the testimony. A figure, appearing and disappearing, steps heard in the night, lamps extinguishing without cause. To the average mind, these are the workings of spirits. To a rational mind, they are symptoms, clues, not specters." I listened attentively. Holmes had the ability to imbue even the most frightening scenario with a sort of intellectual serenity. One felt that, no matter how uncanny, logic could always prevail. "We must consider," he continued, "the architecture of the house, the habits of the occupants, and the natural quirks of the human eye and ear. Often, what appears supernatural is merely a composite of shadows, reflections, echoes, and heightened anxiety." I noted that, despite his calm manner, there was a spark of genuine anticipation in his gaze, the kind that signals the beginning of a profound investigation. "Tomorrow," he said, turning suddenly to me with the authority of one who had already charted a course through the labyrinth of uncertainty, "we visit the household once more. But tonight, we must prepare. There are devices to be considered, measurements to be taken, and most importantly angles to observe which may yield insight invisible to the ordinary observer." I attempted to match his energy, making notes, and reviewing the initial account of the Wimpole Street disturbances. The more I read, the more curious I became. Small details which had seemed innocuous, such as the exact pattern of wear upon the stairs, or the specific timing of the noises, took on a peculiar significance in the light of Holmes' comments. As the evening wore on, Holmes became engrossed in an experiment involving the measurement of light and shadow in relation to the staircase. He constructed a crude model from cardboard, meticulously replicating the exact angles of the steps, the position of the banisters, and even the proximity of the gas lamps in the hallway. I watched him work, silently admiring the thoroughness with which he approached even the smallest details. "You see, Watson," he said, gesturing to the model, "if a person were to move along these steps in a particular manner, and the lamps were extinguished at precisely the right moment, One could give the impression of a figure appearing and disappearing at will. Add to this the human propensity for fear, and the imagination magnifies the illusion tenfold. I was struck by the simplicity of the principle and the complexity of its potential application. Holmes had reduced the terrifying spectacle of the haunted staircase to a question of angles, timing, and human perception. Yet, I could not shake the feeling that there was more at work than mere trickery. The conviction of the lady and her husband, the terror of the servants, seemed too genuine to be entirely fabricated. Holmes, reading my expression, merely smiled. "Patience, Watson. Logic is our lantern in this fog. The steps themselves may be innocent, the shadow may be real, or the shadow may be a mask for something far more sinister. We shall discover which, in due course." As the night drew on, I could hear the distant rumble of the city beyond our window, the clatter of horse-drawn cabs, the occasional shout of a street vendor, the soft murmur of the Thames. London in November carries with it a peculiar stillness, punctuated by fleeting sounds that stir the imagination. I reflected that our walk to Upper Wimpole Street the previous night had merely been an introduction to a much larger enigma. One which, I suspected, would draw us into the depths of human cunning, fear, and perhaps even malevolence. Finally, Holmes sat back, stretching his long arms, and regarded me with that piercing gaze which seemed to look both at and through my very thoughts. "Tomorrow, Watson, we make our observations in situ. And when we do, I shall require your full attention, for the slightest oversight may confound even the most astute observer. Every creak, every flicker of light, every tremor of air may prove crucial." I nodded, fully aware that in Holmes' world, nothing was insignificant, and that what seemed trivial often concealed the key to understanding. That night I slept fitfully, my dreams haunted by shadowy staircases, fleeting figures, and the faint echo of footsteps that seemed to move both toward and away from me in the dark. And so the stage was set: London's fog-bound streets, the trembling household of Upper Wimpole Street, and a staircase whose secrets defied ordinary explanation. I knew, with a certainty that comes only to those who have walked in Holmes' company, that we were at the threshold of a mystery both perplexing and profound, and that the coming days would test every faculty of observation, patience, and reasoning that we possessed. The following morning, the fog hung low over London, a grey, damp blanket that muffled the clatter of cab wheels and dulled the gas lamps along Baker Street. Even in daylight, the city carried an air of brooding mystery, as though it conspired to conceal the secrets that waited just beneath its cobblestones. Holmes moved through the streets with his usual purposeful stride, his long coat flaring about him, eyes darting with the rapid, calculating attention of a hawk surveying a landscape. I, on the other hand, maintained a more cautious pace, my notebook at the ready and my curiosity growing with every step toward Upper Wimpole Street. We arrived at the house shortly before noon. The lady of the household greeted us at the door, her expression a mixture of relief and anxious anticipation. The moment she ushered us inside, it was clear that the entire household had been drawn into a heightened state of alert. The servants whispered nervously, casting furtive glances toward the staircase that had so unsettled them. Holmes, however, appeared entirely unshaken, his gaze focused and precise, as though already seeing what others failed to notice. "I trust you have slept well?" I ventured, hoping to lighten the palpable tension. The lady smiled faintly, though the worry never left her eyes. "As well as one might, Doctor. Though I confess, the thought of last night's events has lingered in every shadow of the house." Holmes inclined his head, listening intently. "Indeed. And we shall see whether shadows or human contrivance have been at work. Pray, lead the way to the staircase." We followed her down the narrow hall to the central feature of this curious residence. The staircase rose in a single straight flight of polished oak, its banister carved in the style of a bygone era. The steps, though well maintained, bore the subtle marks of repeated use, worn deeply in the center, others nearly untouched, as Holmes had noted previously. Holmes crouched low, running his gloved fingers along the edges of the treads and inspecting the risers for minute scratches or indentations. "Notice, Watson," he murmured, "these inconsistencies in wear. They suggest not only the relative weight of the person who ascends and descends, but also the pattern of their movement. One might almost infer the gait and size of the individual simply from these traces. Remarkable, is it not, that would preserve secrets so faithfully?" I leaned closer, examining the steps myself. Indeed, the variance was subtle but evident. Certain steps bore a deeper concavity, as if a heavier foot had trodden there repeatedly, while others remained nearly pristine. It was clear that someone, perhaps more than one, had moved along these stairs in a manner that was deliberate, calculated, or perhaps even ritualistic. Holmes stood suddenly, his long figure casting a shadow across the staircase. We must consider not only the physical evidence but the psychological environment. The terror induced in the household is a vital clue. Observe how fear can amplify perception. To the frightened mind, an ordinary shadow becomes a looming figure, a casual creak transforms into a deliberate footstep. He gestured for me to ascend the staircase with him. "Come, Watson. We shall walk each step in turn, noting every sound, every tremor, every play of light and shadow." The experience was unnerving. As we climbed, the polished steps responded differently under our weight. Some emitted faint, almost musical creaks, while others were silent, yielding no sound at all. Holmes paused at several points, placing his ear close to the wood, listening intently. "The location of each creak," he explained, "is crucial. A single misplaced step, a misaligned floorboard, can create the illusion of movement elsewhere. Note the hollow resonance here." He tapped lightly upon one step-hand. "Compare it to this." He tapped another. Even the most ordinary construction can be transformed by careful manipulation of sound. We reached the top of the staircase, and Holmes' attention turned to the upper landing. "There are 3 doors here, Watson, each with its own unique characteristics. The door to the left is loosely hung and catches the slightest movement of air. The central door has a keyhole that shows signs of frequent tampering. The door to the right is solid, yet the hinges creak in a most distinctive pattern. Any one of these could contribute to the household's fears if exploited with cunning." I observed the doors carefully, taking note of each idiosyncrasy. Holmes, meanwhile, was crouched again, running his hands along the banister, tapping lightly upon the wood. "The staircase is, in effect, a stage," he said, his voice low and precise. "The lights, the shadows, the sound of footsteps, all choreographed by a subtle hand. We must determine whether that hand is human, and if so, who guides it." Our examination was interrupted by a sudden noise, a soft, almost imperceptible shuffle from below. Holmes' head snapped toward the sound, and he raised a finger to his lips. We listened. The sound repeated, this time clearer, a step, deliberate and measured, ascending from the lower floor. Holmes motioned me to remain silent. "Someone is below. Perhaps a servant, or perhaps the source of the disturbances themselves. Let us observe without revealing our presence." We descended carefully, each step taken with utmost discretion. As we reached the ground floor, we glimpsed a figure retreating into the shadow of a hallway's light, cloaked, moving with deliberate stealth. Holmes' eyes followed the figure, narrowing with keen calculation. "Note, Watson, the posture, the pace. That, I suspect, is the hand behind at least some of these disturbances." And yet he paused. Tapping his chin, "There is a complication. Observe how the figure disappears from sight so seamlessly. There is knowledge of the house that only one intimately familiar with it could possess." I could not help but feel a thrill of apprehension. Here, in the quiet of Upper Wimpole Street, amidst shadows and the faint, trembling fear of the household, the mystery deepened. What had begun as a series of inexplicable sounds and fleeting apparitions was now revealed as the work of a cunning Mindor, perhaps minds with intimate knowledge of the staircase, the layout, and the psychology of its occupants. Holmes turned to me, his gaze intense and unyielding. "We shall remain tonight, Watson. We will observe, record, and if necessary intervene. I desire to witness the events firsthand, to see the phenomena as they occur. Only then can we separate the natural from the contrived, the fear from the fact." As evening fell, we took our positions in the shadowed corner of the main hall, hidden from view yet with a clear line of sight to the staircase. The household moved about their routine with an uneasy grace, the servants casting anxious glances toward the stairs, and the lady hovering near the entrance, her hands trembling ever so slightly. The gas lamps flickered and hissed, their light casting elongated shadows across the polished steps. Every creak, every sigh of the wood, every shifting shadow became a note in a symphony of suspense. Holmes whispered instructions to me, noting where I should focus, how to record the slightest irregularity, and where the most subtle manipulations of sound or light might occur. Hours passed, each minute a study in anticipation and acute observation. Occasionally the faintest movement would catch our eyes, a shadow here, a flicker there, but nothing conclusive emerged. And yet, Holmes remained unshaken, his mind already weaving the disparate threads into patterns invisible to my less trained eye. By the time the household retired, still uneasy but convinced that the disturbances had ceased for the moment, I was exhausted yet exhilarated. I realized, with a mixture of dread and admiration, that the haunted staircase was far more than a simple domestic curiosity. It was the stage for a drama crafted with precision, intelligence, and perhaps even malice. Holmes, of course, appeared entirely composed, his mind dancing ahead of the unfolding events, seeing what the rest of us could not. And so, as the lamps dimmed and the night grew heavy over Upper Wimpole Street, I felt the full weight of anticipation. We had glimpsed only the surface of the mystery, yet already it had begun to exert its subtle power upon us. Holmes, ever the master of deduction, had prepared the lens through which we would view the unseen, hear the unheard, and ultimately unravel the secrets of the haunted staircase. The morning following our vigil at Upper Wimpole Street, London greeted us with a sky so leaden that the city seemed to breathe in monotone grays. Even the Thames, usually restless, appeared subdued beneath the blanket of fog. Holmes, as ever, rose early and moved with his habitual briskness, his mind evidently preoccupied, though he said little beyond his customary greetings. I, still alert from our nighttime observations, could sense the tension lingering from our previous investigation. The haunted staircase was no longer a vague domestic mystery. It had become a locus of fear, curiosity, and, as Holmes so often assured me, logical investigation. Holmes and I arrived at Upper Wimpole Street shortly before noon. The household, in the brief light of day, seemed less ominous, yet one could still perceive a lingering apprehension. The lady of the house greeted us at the door, her expression wary but resolute. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice betraying both relief and anxious expectation. "There has been an incident overnight. I fear it may provide some insight into your investigation." Holmes inclined his head politely. "Please, madam, relate the events in detail." "Every minutiae matters, however small." She hesitated briefly before speaking. "It was the footman, Mr. Pritchard. He awoke in the dead of night and saw a figure upon the staircase. He claims he caught a glimpse of a man, though cloaked and indistinct, descending toward the lower hall. In his fright, he nearly fell and fled to the servants' quarters. When the household attempted to verify his account, the figure had vanished." Holmes' eyes narrowed imperceptibly, and he folded his long fingers together. "And Mr. Pritchard's reputation? Most respectable," the lady replied. "We trust him implicitly. He is new to the house, of course, but punctual, diligent, and honest." Holmes rose from his chair and paced slowly, a gesture that always signaled deep contemplation. "Very well," he said at last. "We shall speak with Mr. Pritchard directly." The footman was summoned, a young man with nervous eyes and a pallor that spoke of recent fright. He bowed low, avoiding Holmes' piercing gaze, and recounted his nocturnal experience in a voice barely above a whisper. His story, though coherent, contained gaps, pauses in speech that betrayed either confusion or conscious omission. Holmes listened intently, his hands clasped behind him, occasionally tilting his head as if absorbing not just the words but the subtler truths concealed beneath them. When the young man finished, Holmes leaned forward, his piercing eyes fixed upon him. "Mr. Pritchard," he said in that calm, inexorable tone that seemed to compress space and time, "you mentioned seeing a cloaked figure descending the stairs. Tell me, were there any other sounds? Any indications, however slight, of human presence elsewhere in the house?" The footman hesitated, then admitted, "There was a faint creaking above, sir, as if another step moved in rhythm, but I was too frightened to observe closely." Holmes made a subtle motion with his hand, as if dismissing minor distractions. "Very well. Your account is helpful but incomplete. We shall need to verify the details personally." As we proceeded to inspect the staircase once more, Holmes' attention shifted to a different aspect of the house. "Watson," he said, voice low, "observe the locks and fastenings. In cases such as this, a human hand often leaves a trace, subtle, yet telling. If a man intends to create fear, he must first be intimate with the house. We are seeking familiarity and opportunity." At that moment, a sharp knock echoed through the hall. Mrs. Hudson would have been startled in Baker Street, but here, in the more formal household, the sound carried a weight of urgency. Holmes opened the door, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man in the uniform of the Metropolitan Police. His expression was professional, yet there was a hint of curiosity or perhaps skepticism in his gaze. "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes murmured with a faint sardonic smile. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" Lestrade bowed slightly. "I understand, Mr. Holmes, that you are investigating disturbances at this address. We have been informed by the household that a suspect may be in our custody. A man was found loitering in the street nearby at the hour when the staircase was disturbed. He claims he knows nothing, but he has aroused our suspicion." Holmes' smile did not waver. "And this man, pray, what evidence links him to the events of the night?" "Nothing direct, sir," Lestrade admitted, "only circumstantial. His presence in the vicinity and his evasive answers when questioned. We would appreciate your professional judgment." The suspect was brought forward, a gaunt, wiry man with shifty eyes and a nervous twitch. He introduced himself as Mr. Edmund Fallow, a resident of a nearby boarding house. Holmes' gaze swept him from head to toe, cataloging every nuance. The manner in which he held his hands, the tension in his shoulders, the slight dust upon his shoes, all details which would, in Holmes' methodical mind, contribute to a conclusion far beyond the ordinary. "Mr. Fallow," Holmes said quietly, "you were seen in this area last night, is that correct?" Fallow nodded nervously. "Yes, sir. But I am innocent of any wrongdoing. I merely passed through, on my way home from work." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Indeed. And what is your occupation?" "I am a clerk, sir, in a merchant's office," Fallow replied. Holmes' gaze returned to me for a brief moment, and I noted a subtle flicker of amusement in his eyes, as if he were already several steps ahead. "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes continued, "your suspicion is understandable, yet I caution against premature conclusions. In my experience, the first suspect is rarely the true culprit. We must consider the totality of evidence, not merely circumstance." Lestrade, ever practical, bristled slightly but nodded in acquiescence. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. We shall hold him for the moment." Holmes turned his attention to the staircase again. "Mr. Watson, observe the psychological effect upon the household. The very presence of a suspect creates a form of relief. Fear is redirected from the intangible to the tangible. Yet in doing so, one often misses the subtlety of the real mechanism at work. Fear is easily manipulated, as you will see." As we continued our inspection, I began to see the beginnings of Holmes' strategy. While Lestrade and the household focused on Fallow as the likely instigator, Holmes was already dissecting the environment, the timing, and the behavior of all parties. There were inconsistencies he did not yet reveal to me, details that only he perceived. He crouched, examined the treads, and made faint marks with his pencil, mapping creaks, scratches, and angles of illumination. "It is never the obvious choice, Watson," he murmured. "The mind that wishes to instill fear understands the weaknesses of its audience. It is the one who is least suspected who often wields the greatest influence." By the time we concluded our morning visit, Fallow remained in polite custody, though there was no proof of any connection to the haunted staircase. Holmes, of course, seemed unconcerned by the appearance of resolution. In fact, there was a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes, the spark that always precedes revelation. As we departed Upper Wimpole Street, I reflected on the curious interplay of fear, perception, and suspicion. Lestrade, eager for a tidy conclusion, appeared convinced that the first suspect was the culprit. I, however, could not share in that certainty. Holmes had shown me repeatedly that what is obvious is seldom true, and the shadows of Upper Wimpole Street promised secrets that were yet to be uncovered. Holmes walked silently beside me, his eyes scanning the streets with that preternatural intensity. "Watson," he said finally, "remember this. The mind is a labyrinth. One may believe to have reached the center, only to find new corridors opening unexpectedly. Fallow is a convenient figure, but he is, I suspect, a distraction. The true architecture of the mystery lies elsewhere, hidden in plain sight." I could only nod, my notebook filled with meticulous observations, my mind alight with questions. And as the fog thickened around us on our return to Baker Street, I felt once more the thrilling certainty that the haunted staircase was no ordinary domestic enigma, but a puzzle whose solution would demand every ounce of Holmes' extraordinary faculties and the patience of one devoted chronicler. The days that followed our initial confrontation with the haunted staircase were marked by a peculiar tension. Upper Wimpole Street, though ostensibly calm during daylight, bore the invisible weight of fear, as if the house itself retained the memory of the nightly disturbances. Holmes, ever restless, spent much of his time poring over his notes, examining sketches of the staircase, and experimenting with models of sound and shadow. I, faithful chronicler and observer, recorded his meticulous processes, noting how he measured, tapped, and calculated with a precision that seemed almost superhuman. One afternoon Lestrade called upon us, bringing with him a renewed air of urgency. Fallow, the first suspect, had been released for lack of evidence, though the inspector still harbored doubts. "I admit," he said grudgingly, "that Mr. Holmes has a point. Circumstantial suspicion does not prove guilt, but the household remains convinced that someone or something is responsible." Holmes nodded, his expression inscrutable. "Indeed, Inspector. Yet the truth is seldom found by pursuing fear alone. One must attend to the minutiae, the details overlooked by the anxious or the impatient. If we focus upon the reactions of the household, we may begin to see the invisible hand guiding these disturbances." That very evening, Holmes insisted we return to Upper Wimpole Street. I noted his eyes gleaming with that particular intensity which I had learned to recognize as the harbinger of discovery. The lady of the house greeted us at the door, her relief evident yet tinged with lingering apprehension. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I fear that the disturbances continue. The staircase, it seems to mock us still." Holmes' long fingers traced the banister absently as he surveyed the steps. "We shall see," he said, his voice calm yet commanding. "Tonight, we observe not only the staircase itself, but the interactions of all who occupy it. It is often the human element that conceals the truth most effectively. We positioned ourselves in the main hall, concealed in shadow, our vantage giving a clear view of the staircase and the surrounding rooms. The household retired gradually, the servants reluctant but obedient. Holmes instructed me to remain vigilant, recording every creak, every flicker of gaslight, and every movement no matter how insignificant it might appear. Hours passed in tense silence. Occasionally, a subtle noise, footsteps, the faint rustle of clothing, or the sigh of shifting floorboards punctuated the stillness. Holmes, however, remained patient, his eyes scanning the staircase as though he could perceive its secrets through some extraordinary faculty. It was shortly after midnight that a most curious phenomenon occurred. A lamp, left upon a small table in the hall, flickered violently and then dimmed, as though a sudden gust of wind had passed through the room. At the same moment, faint footsteps echoed along the staircase, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, sensing the familiar thrill of the uncanny, while Holmes' eyes narrowed, calculating and attentive. "Observe carefully, Watson," he whispered. "The manner in which these disturbances manifest is not random. Note the direction of the shadows, the position of the gaslight, and the relative pacing of the footsteps. There is a rhythm here, a method that betrays intelligence rather than accident." As we watched, Holmes' gaze fell upon a tiny detail that I, in my own excitement, had failed to notice. A small smudge of soot along the base of the banister, almost imperceptible in the dim light. "Interesting," he murmured. "This is not the result of ordinary use. The soot has been transferred from a fireplace, yet no one has passed this way recently. Its placement suggests deliberate handling, an attempt to create the illusion of movement or a presence where none exists." He crouched low, examining the steps with precision. "And here, Watson, see these faint scratches along the tread. They do not correspond with the footfalls of the household, nor with the pattern of the footman's movements. Someone has traversed the staircase with a small pointed instrument. The scratches are shallow, deliberate, designed to catch the light in a certain way, perhaps to mislead observers into perceiving a figure that is not truly there." I leaned closer, marveling at the subtlety. "So the hauntings are fabricated?" I asked, though a faint chill ran through me. The notion that human ingenuity could so convincingly replicate the uncanny was both thrilling and disquieting. Holmes nodded, his eyes gleaming. "Precisely, Watson. But observe further, there is an inconsistency here, a detail that even the most attentive eye might overlook. The soot is only on the left side of the banister. Yet, the footsteps are perceived as descending from the top center. Whoever orchestrates this is either unaware of the full effect or wishes us to notice this anomaly. In short, a clue has been deliberately left, consciously or unconsciously, to misdirect or perhaps even to tempt discovery." He paused, running his fingers along the small scratches and soot marks, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. This is what I refer to when I say the first suspect is rarely the true culprit. Fallow is merely a convenient scapegoat. The real manipulator is intimately familiar with the staircase, its angles, and its idiosyncrasies. And yet he smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. They have underestimated the observer. We continued our vigil for several more hours, but the disturbances ceased after the initial display. Holmes made notes, sketched diagrams, and whispered observations, his mind clearly at work on a complex mental lattice of deduction. He did not reveal his full reasoning to me, as was his custom, yet I sensed the contours of a profound insight forming. As dawn approached, the household stirred from their uneasy sleep. The lady greeted us with gratitude tinged with lingering fear. "Did you see anything, Mr. Holmes?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Holmes inclined his head. "Sufficient to confirm that the events are neither supernatural nor haphazard. The staircase is a stage, manipulated by human intent. We have yet to identify the actor, but we now possess the first true clue and inconsistency in the orchestration of the disturbances. Observe and consider, madam. The truth is hidden in the details that ordinary fear overlooks." As we departed, I marveled at the subtlety of Holmes' reasoning. Where the household saw terror and Lestrade saw a convenient suspect, Holmes discerned an intricate pattern, a human hand shaping the intangible. The scratches, the soot, the precise placement of sound and shadow wall were deliberate, yet they contained a small imperfection, a flaw that only the most perceptive mind could detect. On the walk back to Baker Street, Holmes spoke little, but his long, purposeful stride and occasional glances downward suggested intense contemplation. I, for my part, could only record what I observed and attempt to interpret the significance of the hidden clue he had discovered. One thing was certain: the haunted staircase was no longer merely a matter of fear or imagination. It had become a puzzle of cunning human design, and the true culprit was already manipulating events from the shadows. And in that fog-bound London morning, I felt once more the thrill that accompanies those moments when the ordinary world is pierced by extraordinary insight. Holmes, as always, was several steps ahead, and I, faithful chronicler, could only follow in awe. Knowing that the mystery of the staircase had only begun to reveal its secrets, the week following our discovery of the hidden clue at Upper Wimpole Street brought with it a sense of foreboding that I could not shake. London, shrouded in its habitual fog and drizzle, seemed to echo the unease that had settled upon the household. The haunted staircase, once a mere domestic curiosity, now exerted a palpable influence, drawing attention not only from the family and their servants, but also from the broader periphery of those who prey upon or investigate human fear. Holmes and I had spent much of our intervening days studying diagrams, mapping creaks and shadows, and preparing subtle experiments to test our theories. Yet, even as we refined our observations, I could sense that a new development was imminent. Holmes, as was his custom, spoke little of his suspicions, though his manner betrayed a restless anticipation. It was on a particularly bleak evening, the sky a relentless gray, that we received a summons from the Wimpole Street household. The messenger, breathless and anxious, bore a note written in the lady's familiar hand. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, there has been an incident that defies explanation. Pray come at once. The household is in a state of terror. E.W." Holmes, without hesitation, donned his coat and motioned for me to follow. "Watson," he said, "it appears the stage is set for a second act. We must witness the events personally. Circumstance rarely repeats identically, and yet repetition often illuminates the underlying cause." Upon arrival, we were greeted by a scene of heightened agitation. The lady, pallid and trembling, clutched her husband's arm as she spoke. "Mr. Holmes, it has happened again. Not merely a fleeting shadow, nor a sound to unsettle the imagination, something tangible, something deliberate." Holmes' keen eyes swept the hall. "Pray, recount the events in order." Her husband, still shaken, took up the narrative. "I had retired early, seeking respite from these nightly disturbances. At approximately 2 o'clock, I was awakened by a soft thud from the upper landing. I approached the staircase and saw, distinctly, a shadow descending the steps. It moved deliberately, yet vanished before I could reach it. Shortly thereafter, the library door burst open, and a small chest, my late father's writing chest, was found overturned, its contents scattered. The servants, summoned for corroboration, confirmed the account. One claimed to have heard whispers in a tone that suggested deliberation, though no words could be discerned. Another insisted the disturbance was unlike anything experienced before, a sequence of precise movements rather than random mischief. Holmes, long and silent, began a meticulous examination. He crouched at the base of the staircase, inspecting each tread in succession, his fingers tracing the tiny scratches and faint smudges we had noted previously. "Interesting," he murmured. "The disruption is not random, nor merely psychological. It exhibits design a pattern that persists despite the interval between disturbances." I observed him as he made careful notes, every movement precise, every gesture purposeful. "Holmes," I ventured, "does this confirm your suspicion that the previous phenomena were contrived?" "More than contrived, Watson," he replied. "They are engineered to manipulate the perception of fear. Yet the execution has evolved. Note the escalation. Previously, the manifestations were subtle, almost imperceptible. Now, tangible objects are displaced. The architect of this deception is becoming bolder, perhaps confident that the household has been conditioned by prior events." I followed him as he ascended the staircase, examining the treads and banister with acute attention. "Observe the landing," he instructed. "The scratches continue, but they diverge from the previous pattern. This suggests a second act or the same hand now varying technique. The chest in the library, overturned deliberately, serves as misdirection, a spectacle designed to reinforce the notion of supernatural influence, drawing attention away from subtle evidence." Holmes' eyes narrowed as he focused on a faint discoloration along the banister rail. "Watson, see here. The soot smear is repeated, yet imperfectly aligned with the previous incident. The perpetrator is attempting consistency, yet fails in minutiae. This imperfection, slight as it may appear, is our key. Whoever orchestrates these disturbances is meticulous, yet human." He motioned for me to examine the library. The chest had indeed been overturned with precision. Each item lay in deliberate disorder, as though a careful hand had intended to suggest panic and haste. "The placement of each object is significant," Holmes observed. "Notice the sequence. The heaviest objects nearest the center, the lightest near the edge. The arrangement is designed to mimic a hurried search, yet subtle consistency betrays the hand of someone trained or intimately familiar with the household's routines." I could not help but shiver at the realization. This was no random prankster. We were dealing with an individual who combined intimate knowledge, deliberate orchestration, and psychological manipulation. Holmes' calm, measured manner belied the intensity of his thought. As we reconstructed the sequence of events, a further complication emerged. One of the servants, a young maid named Eliza, spoke hesitantly. "Sir, I saw a shadow pass by the window, reflected from the street lamp. It seemed to move in coordination with the sounds on the stairs, but it was outside, yet connected somehow. I cannot explain it." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "Precisely, Watson. Here we observe the deliberate use of external influence, light, reflection, and shadow to reinforce the illusion. Our unknown manipulator is clever enough to employ environmental factors, integrating them seamlessly into the household's perception." I took careful notes as Holmes outlined a plan. "Tonight," he said, "we shall not merely observe. We shall provoke the phenomenon, and in doing so, we may discern the method, or even glimpse the hand behind it. Fear can be managed. A careful stimulus will elicit a response from our unseen adversary." By the time evening descended, fog rolling once more along Baker Street and beyond, the household was primed for our experiment. Lamps were positioned strategically, doors partially opened to create deliberate sounds, and the servants briefed in silent anticipation. Holmes, as always, maintained an air of serene command, his presence at once reassuring and subtly intimidating. As midnight approached, I could feel the tension in the house coalesce. Every creak, every flicker of light, every subtle gust of wind became magnified. Then, as though on cue, the faint footsteps began deliberate, slow, echoing along the staircase. Holmes motioned for silence, his eyes scanning the landing with an intensity that made my own pulse quicken. A shadow appeared, fleeting and indistinct, yet every movement suggested intent. Holmes whispered to me, "Observe carefully, Watson. This is no longer a matter of conjecture. Our perpetrator is responding to the environment we have controlled. The trap is set, the actor will reveal himself or herself." Hours passed in tense anticipation. Each sound, each flicker of shadow provided a piece of the puzzle. Holmes' analytical gaze dissected them with unerring precision, cataloging, deducing, and anticipating. Though the household remained in apprehensive silence, I felt the inexorable approach of revelation, a truth hidden in shadow, waiting for Holmes to expose it. By dawn the disturbances had ceased, yet the impression of human ingenuity, psychological manipulation, and meticulous design remained indelibly upon my mind. Holmes, as ever, refrained from full disclosure, his thoughts turning inward, preparing for the eventual confrontation with the architect of fear. I realized with a mixture of awe and apprehension that the case had escalated beyond simple curiosity. The haunted staircase was no longer merely a domestic nuisance, it was a stage upon which a cunning mind orchestrated a performance of terror, and we were both audience and detectives in a drama that was only beginning to unfold. The week following our second vigil at Upper Wimpole Street revealed London in a state of perpetual gloom, as if the very city itself were complicit in the subtle terrors unfolding within that house. Holmes, in his usual manner, took to long walks along the Thames and through the misty thoroughfares, ostensibly to refresh his faculties, though it was clear to me that his thoughts never wandered from the staircase and its hidden machinations. I, by contrast, attempted to reconcile my own nervous anticipation with the careful observations I recorded, feeling increasingly that we were entwined in a drama that had grown beyond ordinary fear into the realm of deliberate human deception. Our next visit to the household was prompted by an urgent note from the lady herself. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. Inexplicable events continue, and now the servants speak of sightings not of one, but two figures. They claim the staircase is no longer haunted by a single shadow. Please come at once. E.W." Holmes barely glanced at the paper before folding it and tucking it into his coat pocket. "Watson," he remarked quietly, "mischief is evolving. Our unseen antagonist grows bolder, employing not merely the ordinary tools of sound and shadow but the clever employment of psychological expectation. We are dealing now with misdirection of the most intricate order." Upon our arrival we were met with a household in a state of visible distress. The servants whispered nervously amongst themselves, casting anxious glances at the staircase, while the lady's pallor suggested sleepless nights and worry accumulated over many days. Holmes' keen eye, as always, missed nothing. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling, "it is as if the staircase itself has come alive. Two figures, indistinct, yet present, moving in concert." Holmes inclined his head. "Describe their movement if you can." "They ascend and descend with precision," the lady replied, "and yet disappear when approached. The footman insists that he has seen them at the top and bottom simultaneously, though he could not be mistaken." Holmes' lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "Not mistaken, madam, but misled. Fear has sharpened perception while blurring reason. There is more than one hand at play here, at the very least, one hand employing clever techniques to suggest multiplicity." I followed Holmes closely as he approached the staircase. His long fingers traced the banister with deliberate care, noting the subtle differences from our previous visit. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, "the pattern of creaks has changed. Previously the noise corresponded to a single sequence. Now we have overlapping sounds, almost imperceptibly offset. A single observer might perceive two separate presences." He crouched low, examining a subtle discoloration along the wood. "And here we see the second layer of deception. A smear of wax and dust, applied with knowledge of how light from the lamp would reflect upon the steps. The effect is one of multiplicity, though in reality, only a single actor is responsible. Note also the footprints in the dust, one faint, another barely visible, both aligned to suggest separate movement." Holmes paused, tapping a pencil lightly against his notebook. "Misdirection is an art, Watson. It thrives upon the weaknesses of attention, upon fear's propensity to exaggerate. The public mind, or that of a household in terror, eagerly completes the gaps with imagination, creating phantoms from subtle cues." We were interrupted by Inspector Lestrade, who had arrived without notice. "Mr. Holmes," he said, frowning, "we have detained another suspect, a man named Gregory Marsh, formerly employed by the household as a carpenter, was seen lurking near the street last night. He claims he was merely observing the house, but it seems a convenient coincidence." Holmes' expression remained impassive. "Convenience is the hallmark of misdirection, Inspector. We must tread carefully. Appearances are rarely proof of guilt. A clever manipulator anticipates such assumptions. Marsh, when brought before us, was a wiry man with calloused hands and an uneasy gaze. Holmes scrutinized him with his usual intensity, noting the alignment of fingernails, posture, and the faint smell of sawdust clinging to his coat. "Mr. Marsh," Holmes said, "what brought you near Upper Wimpole Street last night?" "Merely to observe, sir," Marsh replied, avoiding Holmes' gaze. "I heard talk of disturbances and—" Holmes raised a finger, indicating an unseen subtlety. "Curiosity indeed. And yet, the angle of your coat, the wear on your boots, and the pattern of your gloves suggest you have handled timber recently. Are you certain your curiosity did not extend further into the house?" Marsh protested vigorously, yet Holmes' gaze remained unyielding, dissecting not just his words but the very manner in which he spoke them. Lestrade, impatient, glanced at Holmes. "Is he guilty or not?" Holmes' reply was measured. "I cannot confirm guilt, Inspector. What I can say is that he is convenient, and convenience is often the cloak of misdirection. It is also possible he has been manipulated, intentionally or otherwise, to present a distraction from the true architect of these events." Holmes turned to me as we departed Upper Wimpole Street. "Watson, observe the psychology at work. Fear and expectation create fertile soil for deception. Each suspect, each fleeting shadow, is a layer in a carefully orchestrated illusion. The household sees two figures, the police see two suspects, and yet reality may contain only one hand guiding all. Misdirection is designed to divert the mind from the essential clue, the subtle imperfection that exposes the orchestrator." I noted his words, recognizing the profound challenge before us. The haunted staircase was no longer merely a domestic curiosity or an isolated incident. It had become a theater of manipulation, where perception, expectation, and fear were wielded with precision. Returning to Baker Street, Holmes immediately set about examining his notes and diagrams, overlaying our observations with sketches of footsteps, light angles, and the sequence of noises. "It is remarkable, Watson," he said, almost to himself, "how one mind can manipulate so many variables and yet reveal its own inconsistency through the smallest flaw. All it takes is patience, observation, and the ability to perceive what others overlook." As night fell over London, I could not shake a lingering unease. The misdirection had deepened, drawing even the police into error and convincing the household that the disturbances were multiplied. Yet, as always, I trusted Holmes' extraordinary faculties. The truth, I sensed, was present somewhere in the labyrinth of shadow, sound, and human cunning, and Holmes, as ever, was silently assembling the pieces that would one day expose it. In the quiet of Baker Street that night, I reflected upon the complexity of the case. Where the ordinary mind sees chaos and fear, Holmes perceives design and intention. The haunted staircase, with its shadows and smudges, its creaks and flickering lamps, had become a stage for deception, and the true performer had yet to reveal himself. But I knew, with the certainty that comes from years of faithful observation, that Holmes was closer than ever to unraveling the tangled threads, and that the misdirection, intricate as it was, would ultimately betray its author. The days following the escalation at Upper Wimpole Street were marked by an almost palpable tension that clung to Baker Street. London's fog seemed thicker than ever, curling around gas lamps and darkened alleys as if to shroud the city in mystery and concealment. Holmes spent much of his time in the sitting room, surrounded by sketches, diagrams, and notes, his long fingers tracing lines and marking angles with meticulous precision. I, as always, attempted to follow his reasoning, recording observations, though I knew my comprehension was limited compared to his extraordinary faculties. Holmes, unusually, spoke little, but I observed a subtle intensity in his eyes, a gleam of anticipation that suggested a plan was taking shape. Finally, one morning, he broke the silence. "Watson," he said, his voice measured, "we are on the verge of eliciting a response from our unseen adversary. All previous attempts at concealment have left minute imperfections. It is these imperfections that will betray the manipulator, and tonight, we shall provoke them deliberately." I was intrigued. "You mean, Holmes, that we will create some circumstance to force the culprit into action?" "Precisely," he replied. "A stimulus, a controlled situation designed to observe the methods and tendencies of the individual. In essence, Watson, we shall place a trap, not of physical constraint, but of psychological compulsion. Fear, expectation, and opportunity combined will reveal the hand behind the disturbances. That evening we arrived once again at Upper Wimpole Street. The household was tense but obedient to Holmes' instructions, following his guidance with a mixture of faith and unease. Lamps were positioned strategically to cast deliberate shadows, doors were left slightly ajar to produce controlled drafts, and subtle noises were prepared, moving curtains, a carefully timed tap upon the banister, and even the manipulation of a small bell to mimic a distant sound. Holmes explained the procedure to me as we prepared our observation posts. We must make the environment suggest opportunity as well as visibility. The manipulator thrives in darkness and uncertainty. Tonight, we will provide both, but with controlled boundaries. Every movement, every sound, every shadow is calculated to draw out the perpetrator. As midnight approached, I felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. The household had retired, leaving Holmes and me alone in the dimly lit hall, our vantage allowing a clear view of the staircase and upper landing. Every creak of wood, every flicker of gaslight seemed magnified, as if the house itself were aware that observation and revelation were imminent. Holmes whispered instructions, noting how I should record each subtle movement, each sound, and each reflection of light. Observe carefully, Watson. The first clue is often trivial, the second confirms intent. It is the interplay of the two that exposes design. Minutes passed with tense quietude, until the first sound reached us, a deliberate creak, unmistakably from the upper steps. Holmes' eyes lit with quiet satisfaction. "Excellent," he murmured. "Notice the rhythm. The actor is responding, albeit cautiously. Our stimulus is working." The steps paused, then continued, ascending in a deliberate pattern. Holmes leaned close, his long fingers tapping against his notebook as he sketched the trajectory. "See how the movement corresponds to our adjustments, the light, the draft, the sound. The manipulator is adapting, testing, and revealing technique. Note also the alignment of shadows. A careful hand attempts to use ambient factors to amplify perception. A faint shadow appeared at the top of the staircase, indistinct and flickering with the movement of the lamp below." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Observe the subtle imperfections, the positioning of the cloak, the timing of steps. The manipulator's skill is evident, yet minor flaws betray human fallibility." Then, without warning, the figure descended rapidly toward the landing, stopping at a precise point predetermined by Holmes' placement of objects and sounds. At that moment, Holmes motioned silently, and I glimpsed him spring into action with a subtle prearranged signal. "Now, Watson," he whispered, "we observe the reaction to constraint." The figure paused, hesitant, realizing perhaps that the environment had been subtly controlled. It moved cautiously, testing for traps, yet in its very hesitation it revealed the patterns of its movements, the method of its manipulations, and most crucially the knowledge of the house required to execute such precision. Holmes noted every detail, the subtle shift of weight, the flick of a hand, the pattern of footsteps, each observation forming a lattice of deduction. "Watson, you see, the genius of our adversary is not in the creation of fear alone, but in the anticipation of human response. Observe how each step is calculated, not merely to instill terror, but to misdirect attention from the true locus of activity." Minutes stretched into an hour, each measured in silence, observation, and meticulous note-taking. Then, just as the first hints of dawn began to filter through the misted windows, the figure attempted to retreat. Holmes, anticipating this move, whispered, "The trap is set, the net tightens, watch closely." The shadow hesitated, then advanced toward a false exit to corridor we had intentionally left unlit and inviting. The person's hand brushed against the banister, leaving a faint smear of soot, and in doing so revealed a deliberate pattern of movement we had anticipated. Holmes' eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "There, Watson. That tiny imperfection confirms our hypothesis. The manipulator is confined within predictable parameters of action." The shadow, realizing it was observed, vanished momentarily behind a curtain, only to reappear at another point, a calculated attempt to misdirect us. Holmes leaned close to me. "Note the sequence. The hand that manipulates the staircase also manipulates perception. Every action is deliberate, yet the smallest oversight, smudge, scratch, or hesitation betrays the human mind behind the spectacle. By the time the household began to stir with morning light, the figure had retreated entirely, leaving only the marks of their passage and Holmes' meticulous observations. The controlled stimuli we had introduced had worked. The manipulator's hand, method, and psychological patterns were now clearer than ever. Holmes, as always, refrained from revealing the full extent of his deductions, preferring to allow the evidence to speak for itself when the moment of confrontation arrived. As we departed Upper Wimpole Street, I could sense Holmes' satisfaction. The trap had not yet caught the culprit physically, yet it had cornered the mind. The manipulator had responded predictably to provocation, leaving behind the subtle clues that Holmes needed to unravel the full mystery. On the walk back to Baker Street, I reflected upon the extraordinary patience and precision of Holmes' plan. Where ordinary investigation relies upon questioning witnesses or gathering superficial evidence, Holmes had created a controlled environment, a psychological experiment designed to force the unseen hand into revealing itself. It was a brilliant, almost ruthless strategy, requiring not only intellect but courage, and I felt a mixture of awe and apprehension at the unfolding method. I realized, with renewed certainty, that the haunted staircase was no longer merely a series of eerie disturbances. It had become a theater for human ingenuity, fear, and cunning. And Holmes, with his unparalleled skill in observation, deduction, and strategy, was poised to expose the invisible actor whose manipulations had long confounded both the household and the police. It was on a damp and mist-laden evening that Holmes, with an unusual gleam in his eyes, declared that the time had come to resolve the mystery which had so long plagued Upper Wimpole Street. I, accustomed as I was to his extraordinary confidence, felt a thrill of anticipation mingled with apprehension. There was a certain finality in his manner, a sense that the long nights of observation, the meticulous recording of creaks and shadows, and the endless scrutiny of minuscule traces were approaching their culmination. "Watson," he said, folding his long fingers behind his back as we prepared to depart Baker Street, "the stage is set for the denouement. I have arranged for all parties, household, police, and, most importantly, our unseen manipulator to be present. By careful orchestration, the truth will be revealed, and the artifice laid bare." We arrived at Upper Wimpole Street to find the household assembled in the main hall, the servants whispering nervously, and Inspector Lestrade standing with an air of eager expectation. Holmes' presence seemed to steady the atmosphere. The very shadows of the house appeared to bend in attention to his will. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, his voice calm yet commanding, "we are gathered here tonight not merely to recount events, but to observe the resolution of a mystery which has confounded both reason and imagination. For weeks, this staircase has been the scene of disturbances, seemingly supernatural, yet entirely the work of human ingenuity. Our task is to discern the mind behind these events, and to understand the method and motive which guided them." I watched, fascinated, as Holmes' gaze swept the room, finally settling on the banister and the upper landing, his eyes calculating angles, shadows, and trajectories with unerring precision. "Let us recall the sequence," he continued. "First, subtle sounds, creaks, whispers, shadows in motion. These initial disturbances were designed to unsettle the household, to condition perception, and to misdirect attention. The first suspect, Mr. Fallow, appeared convenient and plausible, yet closer scrutiny revealed no direct involvement. The second suspect, Mr. Marsh, likewise, was enticed by circumstance and observation, yet the evidence of hand and method did not align with his abilities or position." Holmes turned slightly, fixing his gaze upon the assembled household and the inspector alike. "The true manipulator is, in fact, someone intimately familiar with the household, its habits, and its architecture. This individual has employed environmental factors, light, shadow, sound, and even the placement of objects to create the illusion of multiple actors, to magnify fear, and to elicit false conclusions. And yet, in the course of these disturbances, one subtle imperfection has persisted, unnoticed by all but the most attentive observer. I observed him closely, realizing that he was building toward a revelation both intellectual and dramatic." He gestured to the staircase. "Consider the soot, carefully placed to suggest movement where none existed. The scratches, designed to mimic footfalls, yet misaligned with ordinary patterns. The displacement of objects, calculated to produce fear, yet leaving minute, revealing traces. These are the fingerprints of a mind both clever and human, a mind that, despite skill, cannot avoid error entirely." Holmes paused, letting the silence heighten anticipation. Then, with a subtle nod to Lestrade, he continued, "Inspector, if you will observe the small chest in the library, you will note the placement of papers and inkwells. These are arranged deliberately to suggest panic and intrusion, yet the pattern betrays familiarity, a knowledge of the household's routines, and of the precise timing required to avoid detection. There is only one person with both the opportunity and the insight to execute such maneuvers." At this, a murmur ran through the assembled crowd. Holmes turned to the lady of the house. "Madam, consider the subtle misalignment of your curtains on the upper landing, noted in my previous observations. That misalignment, combined with the soot and scratches, indicates a single manipulator, acting under the cloak of night, exploiting perception and expectation to craft a carefully controlled illusion." I felt my pulse quicken. Holmes' reasoning, though clear to him, left the household in a state of dawning comprehension, and Lestrade fidgeted, realizing that the case was far more complex than the police had anticipated. Holmes moved deliberately to the upper landing. "And now, we shall reveal the hand behind these orchestrations." His voice, firm and commanding, echoed through the hall. From behind the staircase, a figure stepped forward, a young maid, pale and trembling. Her wide eyes betrayed both fear and resignation. "Miss Eliza," Holmes said softly, yet with undeniable authority, "it is you who has manipulated these disturbances. Your familiarity with the household, your observation of its routines, and your understanding of human fear have allowed you to craft an intricate illusion of the supernatural. You intended to terrify, to misdirect, and perhaps to test the attentiveness of those around you. And yet, your methodical execution left the very traces we have observed. The soot smudges, the scratches, the strategic placement of objects, all signs that, while clever, could not escape detection by a mind trained in observation." The maid gasped, covering her mouth with trembling hands. I only wanted to frighten them. I did not intend harm," she whispered. Holmes' eyes softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. "Intent does not negate the method, Miss Eliza. You have demonstrated ingenuity, yet your actions have caused fear and disruption. What you sought in shadow and sound has been revealed through observation and deduction." Lestrade, momentarily speechless, nodded slowly. "Remarkable, Mr. Holmes. Remarkable indeed. And all this—" Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely, Inspector. The genius of deduction lies in noticing what others overlook, in tracing the smallest deviation from expectation to its source. Fear, when manipulated, is both a tool and a trace, and the human mind, in its cleverness, always betrays itself in the minutest detail." Turning to me, Holmes added quietly, "Watson, observe how misdirection collapses under the weight of consistent observation. 2 false suspects, multiple perceived figures, and apparently haunted staircase, all illusions, yet all revealing truth when scrutinized with patience, logic, and attention to detail. The household, though relieved that the mystery was resolved, remained silent, absorbing both the complexity of the deception and the brilliance of Holmes' deduction. I felt a familiar admiration, mingled with awe, as I recorded the conclusion, knowing that the interplay of fear, human ingenuity, and meticulous observation had been masterfully exposed. Holmes concluded with a quiet philosophical reflection. The human mind is capable of both ingenuity and error. Fear magnifies both. Perception distorts, and expectation misleads. It is the duty of observation, reason, and patience to pierce illusion and reveal reality. In this case, Watson, the haunted staircase was never haunted at all, but it has illuminated the extraordinary interplay of psychology and cunning, of error and insight. As the household settled, relieved and chastened, I reflected upon the events that had brought us to this denouement. The mystery, intricate and layered, had tested our patience, observation, and intellect. And Holmes, as ever, had demonstrated the extraordinary capacity of deduction to unravel even the most elaborate of deceptions, leaving the observer in a state of both admiration and wonder. The morning following the revelation at Upper Wimpole Street was quiet, yet charged with a peculiar tension, as if the very walls of the house still hummed with the memory of the events that had transpired. The household, though relieved that the mystery of the haunted staircase had been resolved, was nevertheless subdued, its members grappling with the realization that the source of fear had been a person they had trusted, someone whose ingenuity had been cloaked in innocence. Holmes and I arrived early to witness the aftermath. The lady of the house met us at the door, her face pale but steadier than it had been in weeks. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said softly, "I cannot express my gratitude. Though I am shocked by the identity of the perpetrator, your guidance has brought clarity and relief. We can, at last, move forward without fear." Holmes inclined his head, his expression gentle yet reserved. "Madame, the resolution of a mystery is seldom solely a matter of revelation. It is also a lesson in observation, patience, and understanding the subtleties of human behavior. Fear, once unmasked, loses its dominion, and insight replaces imagination." I followed Holmes into the main hall, noting the subtle changes in the household. Servants moved with measured steps, their nervous glances replaced by cautious confidence. The furniture, previously arranged to suggest chaos, had been restored to order, and the staircase, once a theater of manipulation and terror, now appeared ordinary, its polished banister reflecting the early morning light without hint of mystery. Inspector Lestrade arrived soon after, his usual officious air tempered by a hint of respect. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, "I must admit that the resolution of this case surpasses anything we could have anticipated. The sophistication, the psychological insight, it is remarkable." Holmes, as ever, remained composed, though there was a subtle satisfaction in his eyes. "Inspector, the case was not one of mere observation or intuition. It required understanding the interplay of human perception, expectation, and error. The manipulator relied upon fear and suggestion, yet even the most careful execution cannot escape the scrutiny of patient and precise observation. The maid, Eliza, was quietly removed from the household by arrangements made to ensure her proper care and the prevention of further incidents. There was no malice in her actions, only misguided ingenuity and the desire to manipulate perception." Holmes, ever philosophical, later remarked on the nature of such behavior. "The human mind, Watson, is capable of extraordinary cleverness, yet it is seldom unaccompanied by oversight. Even genius errs, and fear magnifies those errors." I spent the morning documenting the sequence of events, noting the interplay of light, shadow, sound, and human behavior that had culminated in the exposure of the manipulator. Holmes moved quietly about the house, making subtle observations even after the drama had concluded. It was evident to me that his mind never rested. The resolution of one mystery merely sharpened his faculties for the next. By midday, the household began to regain a semblance of normality. Conversation flowed more freely, and the lady and her husband engaged in light domestic matters that had previously seemed impossible in the shadow of fear. The servants, reassured by the removal of the manipulator and the return of order, moved with confidence, their earlier trepidation giving way to cautious optimism. Holmes and I withdrew to a corner of the hall, where he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. "Watson," he said quietly, "the true measure of a detective's skill is not merely in unmasking the guilty, but in discerning the truth beneath layers of misdirection, fear, and expectation. The haunted staircase was a theater of psychology, and our adversary, though clever, left traces that only the most observant could detect." I nodded, reflecting upon the events with a mixture of awe and humility. "Holmes," I said, "your ability to perceive the smallest inconsistencies, to interpret human behavior with such precision, it is extraordinary. I can scarcely follow, yet I am grateful to bear witness to your methods." Holmes smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. "Watson, it is not magic, nor luck. It is attention to detail, rigorous observation, and the disciplined application of logic. Fear is a powerful tool, yet when paired with human error, it becomes a key to revelation. We have seen, in this case, how the simplest imperfections, a smear of soot, a misplaced scratch, can unravel the most elaborate deception." The household, now fully aware of the explanation, expressed their gratitude in a manner both sincere and subdued. The lady, her hands clasped, spoke with quiet dignity. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you have done more than solve a mystery. You have restored our sense of reason and security. For that, we are profoundly grateful." Holmes inclined his head, his expression serene. "It is my duty, madam, to observe, deduce, and illuminate. Fear, once understood, loses its dominion. You will find that, in time, the memory of these disturbances will fade, replaced by the calm of reason." As we departed Upper Wimpole Street, I could not help but reflect upon the extraordinary journey we had undertaken. The haunted staircase, once a locus of fear and imagination, had become a demonstration of human ingenuity, psychological manipulation, and the power of observation. Holmes had guided us through the labyrinth, revealing not only the identity of the manipulator but also the principles by which perception and expectation could be influenced and ultimately corrected. Back at Baker Street, Holmes settled into his chair by the fire, a pipe in hand, his eyes distant yet alert. "Watson," he said, finally breaking the silence, "it is a rare pleasure to witness the unraveling of a deception so complete, yet so transparent to those trained to observe. The mind that seeks to confound us is invariably betrayed by its own methods, leaving behind the smallest imperfection as a signpost to truth." I sat across from him, recording the final reflections of a case both extraordinary and instructive. "Holmes, I am continually amazed by your ability to discern truth in the midst of fear, misdirection, and complexity. It is a lesson I shall carry always." Holmes inclined his head, his gaze steady. "And so, Watson, we conclude this chapter of observation and deduction. The haunted staircase is no longer a mystery, but a testament to the interplay of perception, ingenuity, and the disciplined mind. In all such cases, patience and attention reveal what is hidden in shadow, and reason dispels the illusions created by fear." As the gas lamps flickered against the foggy streets of London, I felt, as always, a mixture of admiration and relief. The mystery was concluded, the manipulator exposed, and the household restored to peace. Yet I knew that for Holmes, the pursuit of truth was never-ending. Each case, each subtle deviation from expectation, offered a new puzzle, a new challenge for the mind capable of perceiving what others overlook. And I, faithful chronicler, would follow, recording the adventures of a mind unparalleled in its clarity, insight, and brilliance. The days following our resolution of the haunted staircase at Upper Wimpole Street were unusually quiet for London. A rare calm that seemed almost conspiratorial in its serenity. Baker Street, too, appeared to settle into a comfortable rhythm, though I sensed, as I often did, that Holmes' mind was far from idle. He spent long hours in contemplation, seated by the fire, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed on some distant point beyond both the room and the immediate world. On the afternoon following our last visit to the household, I found him standing at the window, gazing into the misted streets below. "Watson," he said at last, his voice low and reflective, "there is a subtle lesson to be gleaned from the events of Upper Wimpole Street, one that extends beyond mere detection. The mind is both capable and fallible. It constructs patterns, perceives threats, and anticipates danger, yet it is always at risk of misdirection when emotion clouds observation." I seated myself nearby, eager to capture his reflections. "Holmes," I said, "the events we have witnessed, so intricate, so deliberate, must surely teach us something about human nature as much as criminal ingenuity." He inclined his head, eyes still tracing an unseen pattern through the fog. "Indeed, Watson. Consider the manipulator ingenious, careful, yet constrained by human limitation. Every design, every shadow, every creak of wood revealed a mind both brilliant and fallible. The human mind, even when operating at the peak of skill, cannot escape its own patterns. It betrays itself in the smallest details, in what I have often termed the imperceptible trace." I reflected on his words, thinking of the soot smudges, the scratches on the banister, and the careful placement of objects, all details that had seemed insignificant to all but Holmes' trained observation. "It seems, Holmes," I ventured, "that fear itself can be manipulated, and yet fear also reveals truth when viewed correctly." "Precisely, Watson," he replied. "Fear, expectation, and imagination are instruments both for deception and for revelation. The clever manipulator employs them to confound others, but the observant mind can invert the process, using the same tools to uncover hidden truth. This is, in essence, the duality of our profession, the very same phenomena that obscure reality can illuminate it if approached with reason and patience." He turned from the window then, his long coat brushing the floor, and seated himself in his chair by the fire, pipe in hand. "Watson, many are content to accept fear as authority, to believe that shadows conceal danger, or that the unknown must be supernatural. Yet it is our task to dissect these illusions, to analyze them with logic, and to reveal the human hand behind the curtain. In every mystery, there is method, however well concealed, and a mind, however cunning, that must ultimately reveal its pattern." I could not help but feel the weight of his words. They were more than reflection upon a single case, they were an exposition on the nature of reasoning itself, a lesson in patience, observation, and the humility required to admit one's own perceptual errors. "Holmes," I said, "you have shown that even the most carefully crafted deception is ultimately vulnerable to scrutiny, provided that scrutiny is patient, disciplined, and unwavering." Holmes smiled faintly, the ghost of a sardonic expression crossing his face. "And yet, Watson, this is a lesson that must be applied continually, for the world offers no respite from human ingenuity, from cunning, or from error. Each case is a reminder that the mind is both an instrument and a puzzle, capable of extraordinary insight, and equally capable of deception." We sat in contemplative silence, the fire casting flickering shadows upon the walls, shadows that reminded me in a subtle way of the staircase itself, a theater of light, darkness, and perception. Holmes' thoughts seemed to hover over the events that had passed, not resting on the triumph of detection, but on the philosophical implications of observation and human nature. Finally, he rose and walked to the window once more, hands clasped behind his back. "Watson, I have often reflected that the measure of a detective lies not merely in the exposure of guilt, but in the illumination of truth, in the revelation of subtlety, and in the teaching that observation must always temper imagination. Our work is never finished. Every illusion carries with it the potential for insight, and every fear conceals a lesson." I nodded, aware that his words were as much a directive to me as a reflection on the case. Holmes' methods were a constant reminder that observation must be rigorous, deduction logical, and patience inexhaustible. "Holmes," I said quietly, "your work on this case will endure, not merely in the revelation of the manipulator, but in the clarity with which you have taught us to see, to question, and to reason." He regarded me with a rare softness. "Indeed, Watson. And it is the faithful chronicler who ensures that lessons endure beyond the immediacy of fear or excitement. Your records of observation, your faithful attention to detail, preserve the truth where casual memory would falter." A quiet moment passed, filled only by the soft ticking of the clock and the distant muffled sounds of London streets, fog-laden and indifferent. Holmes' gaze lingered on the fire for a moment, then returned to me. "The haunted staircase has returned to its proper state. An ordinary set of steps, polished and unremarkable. Yet its lessons indelible. Fear is powerful, but reason is enduring. Shadows can deceive, but observation never lies. And in all things, patience reveals what the hurried eye cannot discern." I felt a sense of closure, a profound respect for the interplay of intellect and philosophy that Holmes had demonstrated. The events of Upper Wimpole Street were concluded, the manipulator exposed, and yet the real triumph was the lesson that truth, meticulously pursued, prevails even over ingenuity cloaked in fear. Holmes finally resumed his seat, pipe alight and eyes thoughtful. "Watson, tomorrow we shall attend to other matters, for mysteries never cease, and observation is a lifelong pursuit. But tonight, we reflect upon the triumph not of force or luck, but of reason, discipline, and the unerring scrutiny of the human mind." I set down my pen and regarded him with admiration. "Holmes, I am grateful as always to witness your methods, and to learn from your extraordinary insight. The haunted staircase is no longer a terror, but a testament to the power of observation and the triumph of reason." Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgement, and in the quiet of Baker Street, I felt the familiar mixture of awe, relief, and intellectual satisfaction. The case was, for all intents and purposes, concluded. Yet in the depths of my mind I knew that for Holmes, every shadow and every subtle clue remained a challenge, an invitation to further observation, and the promise of yet another adventure in the labyrinth of human cunning. The weeks following the resolution at Upper Wimpole Street were marked by a quiet return to normalcy for London. Though for Holmes and myself, the echoes of the haunted staircase lingered in memory. Baker Street regained its familiar rhythm, the smell of tobacco smoke, the rustle of newspapers, and the occasional creak of the floorboards serving as constant reminders of our daily routines. Yet beneath this ordinary surface, I sensed the enduring imprint of the lessons we had gleaned. That fear can be engineered, that perception can deceive, and that the smallest detail may conceal the grandest truth. Holmes, as usual, appeared to move beyond the immediate satisfaction of having solved the case. He spent hours in thought, walking the room, examining his notes, and occasionally peering out the window as if seeking patterns in the fog-laden streets below. I, faithful chronicler, took this as my opportunity to reflect upon the extraordinary series of events we had witnessed, and to consider the profound insights Holmes had imparted. It was on a particularly still evening that Holmes finally allowed himself to speak of the case in a manner that seemed more reflective than analytical. "Watson," he said, leaning upon the mantel, "what we have witnessed at Upper Wimpole Street is more than a mere domestic disturbance or a clever attempt at fright. It is, in essence, a study of human perception and the interplay of expectation, fear, and ingenuity. The staircase itself, though perfectly ordinary, became a theater for manipulation. And yet, the truth was always present, hidden within the subtle inconsistencies and imperfections left by human execution." I nodded, understanding that Holmes' reflection extended beyond the confines of the case. "Holmes, it is remarkable how the smallest trace, a smear of soot, a misplaced scratch, the rhythm of footsteps were sufficient to reveal the entire design of the manipulator. To the untrained eye, they were mere accidents. To you, they were incontrovertible evidence." "Precisely, Watson," he replied, his tone tinged with mild amusement. "The brilliance of the human mind lies not merely in conceiving intricate plans, but in overlooking the most minute details. It is in these details that the observant mind uncovers truth. Every misdirection, every calculated shadow, every engineered creak has a signature, a trace, a tell that betrays its creator." As I recorded his reflections, I could not help but marvel at the balance of logic and psychology that had defined the case. The manipulator, Miss Eliza, though clever and daring, had been undone by the very instruments of perception she sought to exploit. Fear had served as her tool, yet it had also served as the key to her detection. Holmes, ever patient and rigorous, had allowed her methods to unfold, studied them with precision, and then revealed the full structure of the deception to the household and the police alike. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the pipe in his hand glowing softly. "Watson, it is the rare case in which intellect and psychology intertwine so completely, in which fear and ingenuity are both the weapon and the vulnerability. And yet, every such case reminds us of the central principle, that careful observation, disciplined reasoning, and an unwavering commitment to truth are the most potent tools of all." I reflected on the household itself, now restored to calm. The lady of Upper Wimpole Street had regained her composure and the confidence of her household. The servants moved with certainty, no longer shadows of anxiety, and the staircase, once a theater of fear, stood ordinary and benign, a testament to the power of perception and the importance of discernment. In quiet moments, I pondered the implications of the case beyond the immediate resolution. Holmes had not merely exposed a manipulator, he had illuminated the principles that govern human perception, fear, and response. In doing so, he had demonstrated the enduring relevance of meticulous observation and logical deduction in a world replete with distraction and artifice. Holmes himself, in the solitude of Baker Street, seemed to dwell upon this philosophical plane. "Watson," he said one evening, staring into the fire, "the mind that seeks to confound others often leaves a signature, however subtle. It is the task of the observer to recognize these signatures, to connect the minute dots, and to transform chaos into comprehension. In this lies the essence of detection, and in this lies the enduring fascination of our profession." I watched him, ever in admiration, and felt the familiar mixture of awe and gratitude. The haunted staircase had been more than a puzzle, it had been a demonstration of human ingenuity, misdirection, and the enduring supremacy of reason over fear. I recognized, as I often did in moments such as these, that to chronicle Holmes' adventures is to witness the remarkable interplay between intellect, psychology, and the subtle forces that shape human perception. The story of Upper Wimpole Street, I realized, would endure not merely as a tale of a haunted staircase and its manipulator, but as an example of the principles that govern all mysteries. Observation, patience, attention to subtle detail, and the disciplined application of logic are universal instruments, capable of resolving even the most elaborate and confounding deceptions. As the lamps flickered in the foggy streets of London, and the distant clatter of a hansom cab echoed through the alleyways, I felt a sense of completion. The haunted staircase was no longer a source of fear or speculation, it had become a testament to the power of insight and the triumph of reason. And Holmes, as ever, had demonstrated that even in the darkest shadows, the light of observation could reveal all. Finally, Holmes reclined in his chair, pipe in hand, eyes half closed in contemplative repose. "Watson," he murmured, "the world will always present mysteries, both trivial and profound. Yet in all of them, the principles we have observed here, careful observation, logical deduction, and the discipline of thought, remain constant. The haunted staircase has yielded its secrets, but the pursuit of truth continues, endlessly, patiently, and inevitably." I closed my notebook, feeling the satisfaction of a case concluded and a story faithfully recorded. The streets of London stretched beyond our windows, shrouded in fog and mystery, yet illuminated by the certainty that, wherever deception and fear might arise, the trained and observant mind would always find its path to clarity. And thus, the case of the haunted staircase, though concluded in action, endures in lesson. A testament to intellect, patience, and the subtle triumph of reason over the shadowed fears of human perception.